The storm had turned the usually calm river into a churning torrent, but what caught everyone's attention was not the raging water. It was Zara, a pregnant gorilla, clinging desperately to a narrow strip of mud and debris, her eyes wide with alarm and every muscle tense, as if she could feel the current testing her limits. Ranger Caleb had been making his usual morning rounds at Greenfield Wildlife Reserve, clipboard in hand, when he heard a strange, urgent noise over the roar of the wind, a mixture of low grunts and desperate breathing that immediately set his instincts on edge. The riverbank was slippery, water lapping hungrily at the roots of trees, and Caleb could barely make out the massive shape of Zara through the torrential downpour, her wet fur plastered to her body, the swollen curve of her belly visible even from a distance, making the scene all the more fragile and alarming. Other staff members had begun gathering at a safe distance, their shouts barely audible over the storm, unsure of what action to take, while Caleb's heart pounded in his chest, his boots sliding in the mud as he moved closer, scanning for any safe foothold. Something about the way Zara held herself was unnervingly calm yet alert, her gaze fixed on something upstream, making Caleb pause in curiosity and unease, sensing that she had noticed more than just the rising waters. Trees bent under the wind, branches snapping and tumbling into the river, and Zara's ears twitched constantly, following every shift in the environment, every unexpected sound. Caleb called out her name, his voice barely carrying over the gale, and she turned slightly toward him, a brief recognition flashing in her dark, intelligent eyes. And in that instant, he realized the magnitude of what could happen if he misstepped. One wrong move, and the raging flood could sweep them both away. The mud beneath his feet threatened to betray him with every step. Yet Caleb felt an urgent compulsion to reach her, compelled not only by duty, but by an inexplicable sense of connection that he couldn't name. Zara shifted again, balancing delicately on a narrow patch of earth, her body taut, her arms extended instinctively to stabilize herself, and Caleb noticed a subtle change in her posture, a silent plea almost imperceptible to anyone but a trained observer. The situation was mundane in its setting, a river, a flood, a wildlife reserve, but something about the alignment of wind, water, and animal behavior screamed that this was far from ordinary. The staff members held their collective breath, sensing that the unfolding events were breaking away from the rhythm of daily routines, and that the outcome could redefine their understanding of human-animal interaction under extreme conditions. Caleb tightened the straps on his waterproof gear, took a deliberate breath, and stepped forward, the cold water seeping into his boots, his mind racing as he calculated each motion, each potential slip, all while Zara's gaze never left his, as if she already knew he was coming. The river churned violently, debris swirled around them, and in a move that would make anyone watching feel a sudden spike of tension, Zara suddenly extended a massive arm toward a floating branch, catching it with precision that belied the chaos around her, a tiny anchor against the flood, and Caleb froze mid-step, realizing that the next few moments could determine life or death, not just for her, but for the delicate balance between instinct, courage, and the uncontrollable forces of nature. Leaving the audience with a single, compelling thought: what happens next could change everything. The rain continued to hammer the canopy above, each droplet a relentless percussion against the broad leaves, and Zara swayed slightly on her precarious perch, the swollen weight of her belly pressing down, making her movements deliberate and cautious. Her deep, soulful eyes scanned the turbulent waters, not with panic, but with an almost resigned awareness of her vulnerability, a quiet sorrow that seemed to settle over her like a heavy mist. Alone in the middle of the flood-swollen river, she had no companions to share her burden, no familiar voices or comforting touches, only the constant roar of the water reminding her that she was on the edge of the world she had once known. Ranger Caleb had moved cautiously closer, his eyes flicking between the animal and the shifting currents, noting how every subtle motion of her hands and feet spoke of tension, exhaustion, and the immense concentration required just to maintain balance. He knelt briefly behind a thick cluster of trees to assess a safer approach, his breath fogging in the cold, humid air, yet even from that distance, he could see the faint quiver in her shoulders, the way her lips parted as if to exhale in relief or perhaps in silent distress. The normally playful gestures that gorillas were known for were absent. Instead, Zara held herself with a solemn grace, her every movement calculated, conserving energy and strength, betraying the strain of carrying new life while navigating the deadly unpredictability of the river. Caleb whispered softly to himself, partly to calm his own racing thoughts, and partly because he could not help but imagine the isolation she must feel, separated from her usual group, without any familiar companions, her instincts both heightened and burdened by the peril around her. Leaves and debris floated past, brushing against her limbs, each collision a subtle reminder of how fragile her position was, and she would occasionally glance upstream, as if questioning the sudden change in the river, the unfamiliar currents, and the absence of the dense forest cover that normally offered shelter. Caleb watched the way her ears twitched and her head tilted, sensing that she was reacting to stimuli he could barely detect, small disturbances in the water or air that spoke volumes about her acute awareness, an intelligence honed by survival yet weighed down by solitude. A shiver ran down her spine despite the warmth of her fur, and Caleb noticed the momentary hesitation in her grip, a tiny slip on the slick mud that made his pulse quicken. It was a subtle but undeniable sign that her confidence, though strong, was not unshakable. The storm seemed endless, the sky a uniform gray curtain, but the real tension lay in Zara herself, the pregnant gorilla, isolated and vigilant, holding a silent vigil against the flood, her body poised as if aware that each second could bring a new test. As Caleb adjusted his stance, preparing to bridge the final distance safely, he caught a flicker in her expression, a quick dart of her eyes toward the opposite bank, and a faint, low grunt escaped her throat, almost inaudible over the storm. Yet in it lay a haunting message of unease, a signal that something was amiss, and that the situation, already perilous, had an additional layer of complexity waiting to be revealed. Zara shifted again, her movements becoming increasingly deliberate and measured, but Caleb could see that each motion carried a strange precision, unlike anything he had ever observed in a gorilla, pregnant or otherwise. She began tapping one large foot rhythmically against a partially submerged branch, a soft thud that was almost like a heartbeat echoing across the flooded riverbank. Yet the pace changed erratically, quickening and slowing without pattern, making Caleb feel a sudden, inexplicable tension in his chest. Her hands hovered above the water, cupped together as if holding something invisible. Then she would move them in wide, sweeping arcs, tracing patterns that seemed entirely purposeless but undeniably intentional. Every so often, she paused, staring toward the dense forest on the far side of the river, tilting her head as if listening to whispers in the wind, before returning her attention to the debris swirling around her. Caleb's brow furrowed. He had encountered wild gorillas before, but this combination of repetitive tapping, careful sweeping gestures, and the sudden, almost ritualistic pauses was unnerving. His mind raced through explanations. Was she disoriented from the flood? Was the pregnancy affecting her cognition? Or was there something else he could not perceive? Zara's grunts and soft vocalizations became more varied, a series of sounds that did not match the simple alarm calls Caleb had learned to recognize. Each note seemed charged with urgency, yet could not be directly interpreted, and it was enough to make him take a cautious step back on the slick mud. As he watched, she suddenly reached toward a floating log, not to grab it, but to balance it in midair for a brief second before letting it drift away, her eyes never leaving the shifting current, and then she repeated the motion with another piece of debris, faster this time, the water foaming around her legs. Caleb's pulse quickened. He began to feel the eerie sensation that Zara was interacting with the flood itself, almost as if the water and wind were instruments in a game that only she understood, leaving him unsure whether her behavior was protective, exploratory, or signaling something beyond human comprehension. The pattern escalated further when she started weaving the smaller branches together, crafting a temporary platform of debris beneath her swollen belly, a structure that would have seemed implausible for a gorilla in calmer conditions, let alone in the midst of a storm-swollen river, and Caleb could not stop his eyes from widening in disbelief. Then, in a moment that made him stumble backward and clutch a nearby tree for balance, Zara performed an action unlike anything he had anticipated. She picked up a long, slim branch and held it vertically, tapping the tip lightly on the water while shifting her weight with incredible coordination, almost as if she were conducting some silent ritual, her eyes glinting with focus and calculation, leaving Caleb frozen with a mix of awe, unease, and a growing sense of urgent curiosity about what she might do next. Caleb's eyes widened as a commotion erupted from the observation deck above, staff members shouting and pointing at Zara, their voices carrying panic and misunderstanding across the riverbank. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated her intricate arrangement of branches and the rhythmic tapping she had been performing, and to the human observers it looked erratic, dangerous, and out of control. One of the reserve assistants, hurried and flustered, shouted that the gorilla was behaving aggressively, misinterpreting the precise movements and the low, repeated vocalizations as threats, not understanding that Zara was attempting to stabilize herself and interact with the debris for balance. Caleb called out to them, trying to explain that she was not lashing out but merely navigating the flood, but the noise of the storm, combined with the growing crowd of onlookers, drowned his words. As a precaution, the head of the reserve instructed a temporary capture procedure, bringing in tranquilizer darts and nets, while Caleb argued against the escalation, pointing out Zara's careful posture and the intelligence evident in her eyes. Still, the others insisted, fearing the potential risk to anyone nearby, despite the fact that Zara had not made a single threatening gesture toward them. The tension built as the team attempted to separate her from the unstable debris, her sharp movements now misunderstood as defiance, and every adjustment she made to maintain balance was read as erratic or unpredictable behavior. Caleb's frustration surged. He could see the injustice clearly. Zara was not a danger, only a victim of circumstance, yet she was being treated as if she were culpable for the perilous environment around her. From his vantage point, he could feel her unease and the subtle shift in her vocalizations, a combination of alertness and confusion, signaling her awareness that the humans no longer trusted her intentions. One assistant misjudged a momentary lunge as an attack and signaled to move the nets closer, and Caleb realized that the next action, if executed, could immobilize Zara and separate her from the only floating support she had managed to maintain, effectively putting her life at greater risk. Every instinct in him screamed against it, but the team's decision was made hastily, with the assumption that containment was safer than observation, creating a scenario where Zara's careful, reasoned behavior was being penalized, and Caleb could only watch helplessly as she prepared to respond to the looming threat, an action entirely misinterpreted by the humans and setting the stage for a critical mistake about to unfold. As the team tightened the nets around the debris and prepared to separate Zara from her precarious perch, Ranger Caleb's attention was drawn to a subtle detail that had gone unnoticed amidst the chaos. A small tuft of moss, clinging stubbornly to the branch platform Zara had been balancing upon, quivered with a rhythm that matched the shifts in her weight, as if the natural material itself responded to her touch. Caleb squinted closer, noting how each adjustment she made seemed to guide the floating branches just enough to counter the pull of the current, a delicate balance that prevented the logs from drifting apart entirely. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible clue, but enough to make him pause, a flicker of doubt creeping into his mind about the assessment of her behavior. He saw that the moss acted as a natural anchor, helping Zara maintain stability in a way that no human intervention could replicate instantly, and the realization that she had been deliberately using elements of her environment to navigate the flood struck him with quiet awe. Nearby, an assistant whispered to another, commenting on how the gorilla's motions were strangely coordinated, a remark that Caleb had previously ignored, but now it rang with significance. The wind and rain had created a mirror of chaotic currents, yet Zara's feet never slipped beyond what she could manage, and her hands adjusted the debris with a precision that suggested awareness rather than randomness. Caleb's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from a dawning curiosity. Perhaps the animal was not acting recklessly or aggressively, but had developed an intuitive method to survive, a hidden strategy that had been mistaken for erratic conduct. He noted the subtle shifts in her torso as she leaned and counterbalanced herself, and the way the floating branches tilted slightly in response, almost like pieces of a puzzle she was solving in real time. The sound of rushing water and the shouts of his colleagues faded into the background as he focused on the delicate interplay between Zara and her improvised platform, recognizing that the apparent disorder was masking a deliberate, intelligent system. Caleb could not yet decipher all the details, but the image of the moss and its role as a stabilizing agent left him with a creeping suspicion that the gorilla had been misunderstood from the start. He glanced at the assistants who were preparing to tighten the nets further, their motions still guided by fear rather than observation, and a wave of protective instinct washed over him. This small, natural clue, the moss, the careful balance, the purposeful shifts, was enough to make Caleb decide that he needed to intervene, to investigate more closely, to understand exactly how Zara was navigating this deadly situation before any action was taken that could worsen it, setting the stage for a careful, deliberate approach to uncover the truth behind her strange but seemingly reasoned behavior. Caleb's breath caught as Zara shifted again, and suddenly the reason behind her precise, almost ritualistic movements became terrifyingly clear. From the swirling waters around the debris, a hidden undertow surged beneath the surface, invisible to the human eye, a vortex that could have pulled any unwary animal or person straight under the flood. The rhythmic tapping, the careful placement of each branch, the subtle balancing of moss and floating logs. It was all a methodical effort to keep herself anchored while simultaneously guiding the floating debris to create a makeshift barrier that would protect a narrow path for any creature attempting to cross. Caleb's heart pounded as he realized that the erratic gestures had actually been strategic maneuvers to counter the power of the water, to stabilize both herself and the immediate environment, and to prevent the hidden current from sweeping anything into the churning chaos downstream. As he leaned closer, he noticed a small juvenile squirrel clinging to a splintered branch, trembling and nearly submerged, and the truth hit him like a thunderclap. Zara had been maneuvering not only for her own survival, but to shield the tiny creature from the deadly undertow, adjusting her weight and the floating elements to counteract the pull that could have easily destroyed it. Every previous assumption, her tapping, sweeping, leaning, and branch placement, flipped completely. She was not being erratic, aggressive, or disoriented. She was executing an instinctive, almost calculated rescue operation under impossible circumstances. Caleb's eyes widened as he saw her extend an arm, nudging a floating log gently so that the squirrel could scramble safely to a slightly higher patch of debris, then retreat to maintain her own balance, her belly swaying, but her focus unwavering. The assistants froze there, misinterpretations dissolving as the tiny squirrel safely reached the mud bank, carried along the very path Zara had been creating, and Caleb staggered back, mind reeling with shock, awe, and an overwhelming sense of guilt. He had judged her behavior wrongly, assumed danger where there was none, and now the full brilliance of her protective instincts, her awareness of the environment, and her capacity for empathy in the face of mortal peril was laid bare. For a brief moment, time seemed suspended, the rain and roar of the flood muted by the staggering realization that the gorilla, previously thought to be a source of chaos, had been the savior, the unseen guardian controlling the current with intelligence and purpose. Caleb dropped to his knees on the slick mud, speechless, as the water sloshed around him, his chest heaving with emotion, staring at Zara who remained poised, every muscle tense, yet exuding a quiet power and control that made the humans who had rushed to contain her seem small, hasty, and completely wrong in their judgments. The assistants exchanged glances, mouths open, unable to articulate the shift in perspective, and Caleb slowly raised a hand as if to physically shield her from further misunderstanding, the weight of realization settling over him. Everything he had believed about her behavior up to that moment had been a misunderstanding, and now the truth, the raw, astonishing truth, left him utterly stunned and incapable of forming words, a silent acknowledgement of how wrong they all had been. Caleb sank to his knees on the muddy riverbank, the rain still drumming down, but now fading into the background as his mind replayed every moment leading up to this revelation. His eyes swept over Zara, whose calm but purposeful movements had just a few seconds ago saved the juvenile squirrel from the invisible undertow, and he felt a heavy pang of guilt tighten his chest. All those frantic calls to restrain her, the hurried nets, the assumptions of danger. They now seemed like blunders born of fear and misunderstanding. He recalled the rhythmic tapping of her foot, the careful arcs of her arms, the way she adjusted the moss and branches, every action. Previously read as erratic or threatening, now illuminated with clarity as deliberate, protective maneuvers. Caleb's throat tightened as he imagined how terrifying the flood must have felt from Zara's perspective, carrying not just her own weight and the burden of her unborn offspring, but also sensing the peril lurking beneath the roiling water and extending her care to the fragile creature she shielded. The assistants who had moved toward her hesitated now, their expressions flickering with the dawning recognition of their misjudgment, and a hush fell over the riverbank as the scene replayed in slow motion through Caleb's thoughts. The anxious glances toward the forest, the careful stabilizing of the debris, the controlled adjustments to counter the pull of the current, all of it a silent symphony of intelligence, instinct, and care. Tears blurred his vision as he reached out instinctively toward her, not with nets or tools, but with an urgent desire to make amends, to support her rather than constrain her, and a wave of gratitude surged for the clarity she had provided, the demonstration of her understanding and the trust she had extended without words. Caleb's gaze lingered on the subtle arch of her back, the poised sway of her body, and the serene awareness in her eyes, each detail etching itself into his memory as evidence of her courage and foresight. He whispered her name softly, barely above the sound of the retreating storm, and a quiet response in the form of a small shift of her weight acknowledged his presence, an intimate connection bridging the gap of misunderstanding that had threatened to undo everything. The assistants began to back away, their earlier panic replaced with tentative admiration, and Caleb, swallowing hard, made a decisive movement toward her, stabilizing the floating debris alongside her, easing the makeshift platform, and murmuring reassurances as if to apologize for the chaos and mistrust he and the humans had caused. In that moment, as he worked in tandem with Zara to ensure the juvenile squirrel was secure and the debris remained stable, the emotional release overwhelmed him. The guilt of misjudgment melted into profound respect. The earlier fear and urgency transformed into tears of recognition for the intelligence and empathy of an animal he had wrongly condemned, and a deep protective instinct rooted in gratitude solidified his resolve to remain at her side until every threat of the flood had passed, vowing silently that nothing would again compromise the trust she had so remarkably demonstrated. Caleb carefully guided the floating debris back toward the shallower, calmer section of the river, his movements deliberate and measured to ensure that Zara could navigate without the constant strain of the swirling currents. He gathered additional branches and moss, arranging them into a broader, more stable platform that extended like a gentle raft across the water, allowing her to move freely without fear of sudden slips or surges. Zara paused mid-step, studying the adjustments Caleb had made, and then with a subtle nod of her head, she tested the new configuration with a cautious shift of weight, each movement becoming less tense, more relaxed, until finally she allowed herself to settle into a steady rhythm, her limbs easing onto the stable surface. Caleb knelt nearby, continuing to reinforce the platform with smaller debris, the storm beginning to abate as the rain slowed to a gentle drizzle, and he spoke softly to her in soothing tones, acknowledging her intelligence and the remarkable care she had shown, each word a bridge of trust reaffirmed between human and gorilla. The juvenile squirrel, now secure atop the raft near Zara's side, seemed to understand that the immediate danger had passed, adding to the atmosphere of relief, and Caleb watched as Zara adjusted her posture, stretching and relaxing muscles that had been taut with vigilance for what felt like hours. The sun began to pierce through the dissipating clouds, casting golden streaks across the water and illuminating the determined expression on her face, and Caleb realized that the intricate dance she had performed was more than survival. It was a demonstration of awareness, empathy, and resilience. He began to place additional safeguards along the riverbank, shallow anchor points to stabilize the floating platform. Further, a physical gesture that mirrored his emotional commitment to protect her and the life she carried. With each careful placement, he observed Zara's responses, the subtle relaxation in her shoulders, the gentle swaying of her body, as if acknowledging the shared effort, a silent communication of understanding passing between them. The river, now gentler and filled with the soft murmur of retreating waters, reflected a scene of restored equilibrium, and Caleb allowed himself a deep breath, feeling a warmth spread through him as he witnessed her confidence returning, the tension in her movements replaced with a quiet grace. She lifted a hand, placing it lightly on a particularly stable section of the raft, and Caleb instinctively responded by securing an additional branch beneath her touch, a small act that confirmed his commitment to her safety and well-being. The sun caught in her wet fur, glinting like copper and gold, and for the first time since the storm began, Zara allowed herself a moment of stillness, eyes closed briefly, body settling into a state of calm assurance, as if she could finally sense that the danger had passed and that the humans around her recognized her courage, her intelligence, and the care she had instinctively shown. Caleb stepped back slightly, watching her chest rise and fall evenly, a gentle serenity washing over her as the raft drifted slowly toward the bank, and in that instant, the unspoken acknowledgement between them solidified. She was understood, respected, and no longer alone in the chaos. The river's threat softened into a backdrop for healing, love, and cautious hope for the future. The storm had fully passed, leaving the reserve bathed in a soft, golden light that shimmered off the water's surface, and Caleb stood quietly on the riverbank, observing Zara as she adjusted her footing one final time on the stabilized raft. She moved with a calm assurance now, each careful step a testament to the intelligence and foresight that had guided her through the chaos, and Caleb felt a profound stillness settle over him, a mix of relief and awe that the pregnant gorilla before him had not only survived but had maintained the safety of everything around her with such quiet determination. The juvenile squirrel, now safely perched on a higher patch of land, twitched its tiny ears and scampered toward the underbrush, a small but vivid reminder of the lives Zara had protected in ways none of the humans had anticipated. Caleb slowly approached her, hands extended, not in fear or command, but in respect and solidarity, reinforcing the stability of the raft while allowing her the space to assert her agency. Each movement a dialogue between human and animal, a shared acknowledgement of intelligence, courage, and survival. The sun, breaking fully through the clouds, caught in her wet fur, reflecting in a spectrum of amber and bronze hues, and for the first time since the river had surged, she allowed herself a brief pause, chest rising and falling with measured breaths, and a subtle shift of her head toward Caleb, almost as if to confirm understanding and trust. Around them, the reserve team, previously tense and uncertain, now watched in silent reverence, the earlier panic giving way to appreciation, their misjudgments washed away by the clarity of observation and the undeniable proof of her intentions. Caleb stepped back slightly, allowing her full control of her space, and gathered a few scattered branches to gently weave them into a small protective perimeter around the raft, a human gesture that mirrored her own meticulous adjustments to the environment, creating a cocoon of safety that allowed her to settle with ease. He marveled at the balance she maintained, the composure in her movements, and the protective care she had instinctively provided, and a warm surge of gratitude filled him, mingling with the lingering guilt for the misunderstanding that had so nearly compromised her. The light breeze carried the scent of wet earth and leaves, and in that quiet, delicate moment, Zara extended a massive hand toward Caleb, resting it lightly on the edge of the platform, as if offering a silent acknowledgement of the alliance and trust that had been forged through shared risk and understanding. Caleb mirrored the gesture, fingertips brushing hers, a simple act that conveyed volumes, recognition, respect, and mutual appreciation for the life preserved and the intelligence revealed. The river flowed gently beneath them, now a serene backdrop to the scene, and Caleb took a deep, steadying breath, realizing that the lesson extended beyond survival. It was a testament to patience, observation, and the profound wisdom that could be found in another species when one truly paid attention. Zara shifted slightly, settling fully onto the raft, chest rising and falling with rhythmic ease, and in that final, unguarded movement, there was an unmistakable signal of contentment, of safety, and of understanding, a silent promise that she was secure, her courage acknowledged, and her presence honored. Caleb stood in awe, watching her become a living emblem of foresight, care, and calm intelligence. And as the golden light shimmered across her fur and the still waters around them, he whispered softly to himself, a reflection both personal and universal. Some guardians are silent, yet their impact echoes forever.